In the year 747 before Christ, an African king named Pi stood at the gates of Memphis, the greatest city in Egypt, the heart of one of the world's most powerful civilizations. And he did something that would shock the ancient world. He conquered it. Not as a foreign invader from distant lands, not as a barbarian from the north, but as an African king from the south. From a kingdom so powerful, so advanced, so culturally sophisticated, that Egypt itself was merely its northern province. This king, and the dynasty that followed him, would rule Egypt for nearly a century. They would be known as the 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs, the Nubian kings of Egypt. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. These weren't primitive conquerors who stumbled into power. They were the rulers of Kush, a civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years. A kingdom that controlled the gold mines of Africa. A culture that would build more pyramids than Egypt itself. And yet, if you ask most people about ancient African kingdoms, they'll mention Egypt. Perhaps Ethiopia. Maybe Zimbabwe. But Kush? The kingdom of Kush has been erased from history. Until now. Sit back and relax. Let me take you back to ancient Africa. To the land of Kush. Where Africans didn't just build a civilization. They ruled an empire. Before we can understand the kingdom of Kush, we need to understand where it was. Close your eyes and imagine. You're standing on the banks of the Nile River. But you're not in Egypt. You're far to the south, in what is now modern-day Sudan. The landscape around you is breathtaking. The Nile flows through dramatic cataracts, waterfalls, and rapids that make navigation treacherous. On either side, golden deserts stretch to the horizon. But along the river, there is life. Rich, black soil deposited by the annual floods. Palm trees swaying in the breeze. Fields of grain growing in abundance. This is Nubia. The land of gold. The land of ebony. The land of ivory and incense. And this is where the kingdom of Kush would rise. The ancient Egyptians called this region Toseti, the land of the bow, because the Nubians were renowned archers. Warriors so skilled with the bow that even mighty Egypt feared them. But Nubia was more than just warriors. It was a land of incredible wealth. Deep beneath the desert sands lay gold. Not just traces. Not just small deposits. But vast reserves of gold that would fuel empires. The ancient Egyptians coveted this gold. They needed it for their temples, for their tombs, for their jewelry and crowns. And for 2,000 years, Egypt and Nubia would be locked in a complex relationship. Sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as one. The geography of Nubia shaped its destiny. The Nile cataracts, the 6 major waterfalls, divided the region into distinct zones. Lower Nubia, between the first and second cataracts, was closer to Egypt, more influenced by Egyptian culture. Upper Nubia, beyond the third cataract, was more independent, more distinctly African. And it was here, in Upper Nubia, that the kingdom of Kush would establish its heartland. The first capital was Kama, a city that would flourish for over 1,000 years. Later, the capital would move to Napeta, beneath the shadow of a sacred mountain called Jebel Bako. And eventually, after Egyptian influence waned, the capital would move south again to Mary. A city so magnificent, so advanced, that it would be called the Island of Mary, even though it sat on dry land. This is the story of 3 cities, 3 capitals, and one extraordinary civilization. The Kingdom of Kush. Our story begins around 2500 before Christ. That's 4500 years ago. At this time, Egypt's old kingdom was building the Great Pyramids at Giza. But to the south, in Nubia, something else was happening. A culture was emerging that we now call the Kama culture, named after the archaeological site where it was first discovered. The people of Kama were not primitive. They were sophisticated, organized, and powerful. They built massive mud brick structures called defufas. The largest, the Western defufa, still stands today, rising over 18 meters high. One of the oldest standing structures in all of Africa. These weren't just buildings. They were temples, administrative centers, symbols of power. Built from millions of mud bricks, shaped by hand and baked in the African sun. The people of Kama were traders. They controlled the flow of goods from deep Africa to Egypt and beyond. Gold from the mines, ebony from the forest, ivory from elephants, incense from distant lands, leopard skins, ostrich feathers. All of this flowed through Kama. And in return, luxury goods flowed south. Egyptian pottery, bronze tools, fine linens, jewelry. Kama was a crossroads of civilization. But the people of Kama were not merely middlemen. They had their own distinctive culture. Their pottery was among the finest in the ancient world. Thin-walled, perfectly symmetrical, with a distinctive black top and red bottom. So fine that when archaeologists first discovered it, they couldn't believe it was handmade. No potter's wheel. No modern tools. Just skilled hands and generations of knowledge. The burials at Kama tell us even more. The elite of Kama were buried in massive tumulus graves. Circular mounds up to 90 meters in diameter. Inside, the deceased was surrounded by wealth. Hundreds of pottery vessels. Jewelry of gold and silver. Weapons. Tools. But here's what makes Kama burials truly distinctive and deeply troubling to modern sensibilities. Many burials included human sacrifices. Servants, attendants, perhaps wives, were buried alive with their masters. Some burials contain hundreds of sacrificed individuals. This tells us that Kama society was highly stratified. There were powerful rulers, an elite class, and a large population that served them. For over 1,000 years, Kama flourished. It grew in size, in power, in wealth. At its height, around 1600 BC, Kama may have rivaled Egypt itself. But then disaster struck. Egypt's new kingdom rose to power. Under pharaohs like Thutmose I and Thutmose III, Egypt launched campaigns into Nubia. Brutal military campaigns. Kama was conquered. The city was destroyed. And for the next 500 years, Nubia would be an Egyptian colony. But this was not the end of the story. This was merely the intermission. Because from the ashes of Kama, something new would emerge. Something more powerful. The Kingdom of Kush. For 500 years, Nubia lived under Egyptian rule. 5 centuries of foreign occupation. The Egyptians didn't just conquer Nubia. They colonized it. They built fortresses along the Nile. Massive stone structures with thick walls and watchtowers. They stationed garrisons, Egyptian soldiers, to control the population. They installed Egyptian administrators, Egyptian priests. They built Egyptian temples to Egyptian gods. The Egyptians wanted Nubia's wealth. But they also wanted to erase Nubian culture. They wanted to turn Nubians into Egyptians. Nubian children of the elite families were taken to Egypt, educated in Egyptian schools, taught Egyptian language, Egyptian religion, Egyptian customs. These children grew up between two worlds, Nubian by blood, Egyptian by culture. But something unexpected happened. Instead of erasing Nubian identity, the Egyptians created something new, a hybrid culture. Nubians who understood Egypt, perhaps better than the Egyptians themselves. They learned Egyptian military tactics, Egyptian administration, Egyptian religion, Egyptian art and architecture. But they never forgot who they were. They were Kushites. And they were watching, waiting, learning. Then, around 1100 BCE, Egypt began to weaken. The new kingdom, Egypt's golden age, was collapsing. Internal strife, economic problems, invasions from the Mediterranean. Egypt's grip on Nubia began to slip. And the Nubians seized their moment. They didn't drive the Egyptians out with violence. They simply filled the vacuum. As Egyptian control weakened, Nubian leaders emerged. They established a new capital, Napata, located beneath the sacred mountain, Jebel Bakr. Jebel Bakr was more than just a mountain. It was a sacred site. The Egyptians had built a temple there to the god Ammonius. The Kushites adopted this temple. They adopted the god Ammonius, but they made it their own. They claimed that Ammonius, the supreme god, had chosen them. Not the Egyptians, but the Kushites, to be the true, righteous rulers. And around 750 BC, they decided to prove it. They would march north, not as rebels, not as conquerors, but as liberators, as the rightful heirs to the throne of Egypt, led by a king named Kashta, and his son, Pi. In the year 747 before Christ, King Pi sat in his palace at Napata. News had reached him from the north. Egypt was in chaos. The country had fractured into rival kingdoms. Local rulers called themselves pharaohs. They fought among themselves. Temples were neglected. The old gods were forgotten. Moat, the Egyptian concept of truth, justice, and cosmic order, had been abandoned. To Pi, this was intolerable. He had been raised to revere Egyptian culture. He worshipped the Egyptian gods. He followed Egyptian customs. But more than any Egyptian, he understood what Egypt was supposed to be. And he decided that if the Egyptians had forgotten their own traditions, then he, an African king from Kush, would remind them. Pi gathered his army. Kushite warriors, Nubian archers, the finest in the world, cavalry, infantry, and he marched north. The campaign was documented in detail. On a massive stone stela, carved in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Pi recorded his conquest. This stela, discovered in the temple at Jebel Bakr, is one of the most important documents in African history. It tells us exactly what happened. Pi's army swept through Upper Egypt. City after city surrendered. Not because Pi was cruel, but because he was righteous. When Pi arrived at Thebes, the ancient religious capital, the priests welcomed him. They recognized him as the legitimate pharaoh, the one chosen by Ammonius. Pi performed the ancient rituals. He purified himself in the sacred lake. He made offerings to the gods. He observed every ceremony exactly as tradition demanded. The priests were astonished. Here was a king from the south, from Kush, who knew the rituals better than the Egyptian kings themselves. But not everyone surrendered peacefully. At Memphis, the great city of Lower Egypt, resistance was fierce. A local ruler named Tefnach had fortified the city. He commanded his soldiers to fight to the death. Pi besieged Memphis. His army surrounded the city. But Pi did something unexpected. Before the final assault, he noticed that the defenders had mistreated the horses. The cavalry horses inside the city were starving. This enraged Pi. More than the military resistance. More than the political opposition. The mistreatment of horses was unforgivable. Pi loved horses. He was a horseman from a culture that valued these noble animals. The fact that Tefnach had allowed horses to suffer proved to Pi that this man was unworthy to rule. The assault on Memphis was swift and brutal. Pi's forces breached the walls. The city fell. But here's what's remarkable. After the conquest, Pi didn't massacre the population. He didn't burn the city. He didn't loot the temples. Instead, he went to the temple of Thoth, the chief god of Memphis. And he performed the ancient rituals. Exactly as they should be performed. He purified the temple. He made offerings. He reinstated the priests. Pi wasn't just conquering Egypt. He was restoring it. One by one, the rulers of the Delta came to submit. They prostrated themselves before Pi. They acknowledged him as Pharaoh. Even Tefnach, who had fled, eventually sent ambassadors to swear loyalty. Egypt was reunited. Under the rule of an African king, the Black Pharaoh, from the kingdom of Kush. But here's what's even more extraordinary. After unifying Egypt, after achieving what no one had done in centuries, Pi went home. He returned to Napata. He left governors in Egypt. He established his authority. But Pi himself returned to Kush. Because to Pi, Kush was not a backwater. Kush was the center of civilization. Egypt was just the northern province. Pi died around 715 BC. He was buried in a pyramid. Not in Egypt, but in Kush, at a site called El Kuru. His pyramid still stands. And beneath it, archaeologists found his tomb. Inside, Pi was buried with his horses. The animals he loved, given honor in death as they deserved in life. The conquest of Egypt had only just begun. After Pi came his successors, his brother Shaboka, his nephews Shebitku and Tahaka. Together, they would rule Egypt for nearly a century. From 747 BC to about 656 BC. This period is known as Egypt's 25th dynasty. The Kushite dynasty. The Black Pharaohs. And during this time, Egypt experienced a renaissance. Shaboka, Pi's brother, took a different approach. Unlike Pi, who returned to Kush, Shaboka stayed in Egypt. He established his capital at Memphis. He ruled as a true pharaoh. But Shaboka was more than a military ruler. He was a scholar, a patron of learning, a restorer of tradition. Ancient Egyptian texts that had been neglected, Shaboka had them copied. Old temples that had fallen into disrepair, Shaboka restored them. Traditional ceremonies that had been forgotten, Shaboka revived them. Under Shaboka, Egypt looked backward to its golden age. The art, the architecture, the religion, all deliberately recalled the glory days of the Old Kingdom. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a political statement. Shaboka was saying, we Kushites are the true heirs of Egyptian civilization. We remember what you have forgotten. But the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs was yet to come. His name was Taharka. Taharka ascended the throne around 690 BC. He was perhaps 20 years old. Young, energetic, ambitious. And under his rule, the empire reached its greatest extent. Taharka controlled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to deep into modern Sudan. From the Nile Delta to the Sixth Cataract. An empire larger than Egypt had been in centuries. Taharka was a builder. At the temple of Karnak in Thebes, he added a massive colonnade. Columns so tall, so perfectly proportioned, that they still inspire awe today. At Jebel Bakr in Kush, he expanded the temple of Ammonius. He built pylons, courtyards, sanctuaries. He created a religious center to rival anything in Egypt. Taharka commissioned more monuments than almost any pharaoh before him. Statues of himself in Egyptian style, but with distinctly African features. Broad nose. Full lips. He didn't hide his African identity. He celebrated it. Under Taharka, arts and crafts flourished. Kushite metalworkers created jewelry of exquisite beauty. Gold inlaid with precious stones. Sculptors carved statues of breathtaking realism. Scribes copied ancient texts. This was Egypt's last great age. But it wouldn't last. Because to the northeast, a new power was rising. Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was the superpower of the ancient Near East. They had conquered Mesopotamia, the Levant, parts of Anatolia, and now they wanted Egypt. Taharka tried to resist. He formed alliances with Syrian and Palestinian kingdoms. He sent military aid to resist Assyrian expansion. In the Bible, in the Book of Kings, there's a reference to this. When Jerusalem was under siege by the Assyrians, the text mentions Taharka, king of Kush. That's Taharka. The Kushite pharaoh defending not just Egypt, but the entire region against Assyrian aggression. But the Assyrians were too powerful. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. His armies swept through the delta. They captured Memphis. Taharka fled south. But he didn't give up. For the next decade, Taharka fought back. He retook Memphis twice. Each time, the Assyrians returned and drove him out again. It was a brutal, back-and-forth war. Finally, around 664 BCE, Taharka died. His nephew Tantumani tried to continue the fight. But the Assyrians were relentless. They sacked Thebes, the ancient capital. They looted the temples, destroyed the monuments. And the Kushites were forced to retreat. Back to Napeta. Back to Kush. The rule of the Black Pharaohs was over. But the kingdom of Kush was far from finished. After the Assyrian invasion, the Kushites withdrew from Egypt. But they didn't collapse. They didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, they did something extraordinary. They moved their capital even further south, away from Egyptian influence, to a new city, Meroe. And here, free from Egyptian domination, free from foreign interference, the kingdom of Kush entered its golden age. Meroe was strategically located. It sat between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile, far enough south to be protected from invasion, but close enough to trade routes to remain connected to the world. The region around Meroe was ideal. Unlike much of Nubia, which was desert, the area around Meroe received seasonal rains. This meant agriculture without depending solely on the Nile flood. Grasslands for grazing cattle. Forests for timber and fuel. But Meroe's greatest advantage was iron. The region was rich in iron ore, and the Meroites became master iron workers. Archaeologists have found massive slag heaps at Meroe, the waste from iron smelting. Heaps so large that early explorers called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa. The Meroites produced iron on an industrial scale. Iron tools, iron weapons, iron for trade. This gave them a tremendous advantage. While Egypt still relied heavily on bronze, the Kushites had moved to the Iron Age. But iron was just the beginning. At Meroe, Kushite culture truly came into its own. For centuries, under Egyptian influence, Kushite art and architecture had mimicked Egyptian styles. But at Meroe, things began to change. The art became more distinctly African. Pottery featured new designs, geometric patterns, animals native to the region. Sculpture showed more African features. The religion evolved. Yes, they still worshipped Ammonius. But alongside Egyptian gods, African deities emerged. Apigmak, the lion god, a warrior deity unique to Kush. And perhaps most significantly, the Meroites developed their own writing system. For centuries, Kushites had written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. But around the 3rd century BC, they created something new: Meroitic script. This script used symbols derived from hieroglyphs but represented the Kushite language. It had two forms: Meroitic hieroglyphic for formal inscriptions, and Meroitic cursive for everyday writing. Here's the fascinating part. We can read Meroitic script. We know the sound values of most of the symbols, but we don't fully understand the language itself. It's not related to Egyptian. It's not like any known language. So we can sound out the words, but we don't know what they mean. It's one of the great mysteries of African linguistics. The rulers of Meroe were powerful. And here's something remarkable. Many of them were women. The Kushites had a tradition of powerful queens. They were called Kandaks, or in Greek, Candaces. These were not merely ceremonial rulers. They were military leaders, builders, administrators. One Kandak named Amanirenas is particularly famous. When the Romans conquered Egypt around 30 BC, they tried to expand south into Kush. Amanirenas led the resistance. She personally commanded armies against Rome. Roman sources describe her as a very masculine woman, and blind in one eye. She had lost an eye in battle, but she continued to fight. The Kushites raided Roman Egypt. They sacked towns. They carried off statues, including a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus. This head archaeologists found buried beneath the steps of a Kushite temple, so that every person entering would walk over the Roman emperor's face. The Romans retaliated. They invaded Kush, but they couldn't hold the territory. Eventually, Rome and Kush negotiated a peace treaty as equals. Kush was one of the few kingdoms that fought Rome to a standstill. For the next 3 centuries, Meroe flourished. It became a major center of trade. Caravans from deep Africa brought goods north: gold, ivory, ebony, slaves, exotic animals. And in return, luxury goods flowed south: Roman wine, Indian textiles, Mediterranean pottery. Meroe was cosmopolitan, a crossroads of civilizations. But perhaps the most iconic feature of Meroitic civilization was the pyramids. Yes, pyramids. The Kushites built pyramids. Lots of them. In fact, There are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt. Let that sink in. More pyramids in Kush than in all of Egypt. Now, Kushite pyramids are different from Egyptian pyramids. They are smaller, steeper. The sides rise at a much sharper angle. They look more like tall triangles than the broad-based Egyptian pyramids. But they serve the same purpose. Tombs for the elite. Kings and queens were buried beneath these pyramids, surrounded by grave goods, gold jewelry, pottery, weapons. The pyramid fields at sites like Nuri and Meroe itself are stunning. Dozens of pyramids rising from the desert. A silent testament to a forgotten civilization. For over 1,000 years, Meroe thrived. But around 350 CE, something changed. The kingdom began to decline. We don't know exactly why. Some scholars believe environmental change played a role. Overgrazing may have caused desertification. The forest that provided fuel for iron smelting may have been exhausted. Others believe political factors were involved. The rise of the kingdom of Aksum in modern Ethiopia created a new rival. Aksum controlled the Red Sea trade routes. This may have diverted trade away from Meroe. Whatever the cause, by the 4th century CE, Meroe was in decline. And then, around 350 CE, the kingdom of Aksum invaded. They destroyed Meroe. The kingdom of Kush came to an end. After nearly 3,000 years of continuous civilization, it was over. For over 1,000 years, the kingdom of Kush was forgotten. The cities crumbled into ruins. The pyramids stood silent in the desert. Sand buried the temples. Travelers occasionally reported seeing strange structures. Pyramids in the desert. Mysterious ruins. But no one understood what they were looking at. In the 19th century, European explorers began to take notice. One man, an Italian adventurer named Giuseppe Follini, arrived at Meroe in 1834. Follini was a treasure hunter, not an archaeologist. He had heard rumors of gold in the pyramids. So he did something unforgivable. He demolished them. Follini systematically destroyed pyramid after pyramid. Using explosives and battering rams, he knocked off the tops, looking for treasure. And he found it. In one pyramid, belonging to Queen Amani-Shakito, he discovered an incredible treasure. Gold jewelry, amulets, crowns. Some of the finest ancient jewelry ever discovered. But the cost was immeasurable. Follini's destruction obliterated invaluable archaeological context. We'll never know what else was in those pyramids, because he destroyed them. The jewelry ended up in museums in Munich and Berlin, where you can see it today. Beautiful, but stolen. Later, more responsible archaeologists arrived. George Reisner, an American Egyptologist, conducted extensive excavations in the early 20th century. Reisner was meticulous. He documented everything. He excavated royal pyramids at Nuri and El Koro. He found the tombs of the 25th dynasty pharaohs. Pi, Shaboka, Tahaka. But Reisner had a problem. Like many scholars of his time, he couldn't accept that Africans had built this civilization. He theorized that the Kushites must have been light-skinned people from somewhere else, despite the evidence showing clearly that they were indigenous Africans. This racist interpretation dominated scholarship for decades. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars finally acknowledged the truth. The kingdom of Kush was an African civilization, built by Africans, ruled by Africans, and it was one of the greatest civilizations in human history. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover the secrets of Kush. Modern Sudan, where most of the ancient sites are located, has embraced this heritage. Though political instability and limited resources have hampered research, many sites remain unexplored, buried beneath the desert, waiting for future archaeologists. But what we've learned so far is extraordinary. The kingdom of Kush lasted nearly 3,000 years. That's longer than Western civilization has existed. Longer than any empire in European history. Longer than China's longest dynasty. The Kushites mastered iron technology. They built over 200 pyramids. They developed their own writing system. They ruled Egypt as pharaohs. They fought Rome to a standstill. They had powerful queens who led armies. They controlled vast wealth, gold, ivory, exotic goods. They were a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, advanced civilization. And yet, most people have never heard of them. Why? Part of the answer is simple racism. For centuries, Western scholars couldn't accept that Black Africans had built great civilizations. So they minimized Kush, ignored it, or attributed its achievements to outside influence. Part of the answer is geography. Most Kushite sites are in modern Sudan, a country that has experienced decades of conflict, making archaeological research difficult. And part of the answer is that the Kushites wrote in a language we still don't fully understand. So their story, told in their own words, remains partially locked away. But the silence is finally being broken. Let's talk about what made Kushite civilization truly remarkable. First, their architecture. The pyramids we've mentioned. But Kushite architecture was more than pyramids. At Jebel Bakr, the sacred mountain, they built a massive temple complex. With pylons, courtyards, hypostyle halls. Carved from sandstone. Decorated with reliefs. At Muzawarat Yesufra, there's a mysterious structure called the Great Enclosure. A massive complex of rooms and corridors. We still don't know what it was for. A palace. A temple. A royal zoo for elephants. The mystery remains. Second, their art. Kushite art evolved over centuries. Early Kushite art closely followed Egyptian models. But later, especially in the Meroitic period, it became distinctly African. Sculpture showed African features proudly. Pottery featured geometric patterns and animal motifs. Jewelry was exquisite. Gold worked with incredible skill. Inlaid with carnelian, lapis lazuli, colored glass. Some pieces rival anything from ancient Egypt or Greece. Third, their metallurgy. The Kushites were master metalworkers. We've mentioned their iron production. But they also worked gold, copper, bronze. They created sophisticated alloys. They cast complex shapes. Their weapons were high quality. Their tools effective. This wasn't primitive craft. This was advanced, industrial-scale production. Fourth, their religion. Kushite religion was syncretic. They adopted Egyptian gods. Ammonius was the supreme deity. But they also had their own gods. Apidmak, the lion god, was purely Kushite. Depicted with 3 heads or as a lion-headed warrior. They believed in an afterlife. Hence the pyramids and elaborate burials. They had priests and priestesses. Religious ceremonies and festivals. And importantly, the king was not just a political leader. He was a religious figure. Chosen by the gods. Responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Fifth, their system of government. Kush was a monarchy. But succession wasn't always father to son. Sometimes brothers succeeded brothers. Sometimes nephews. And remarkably, women could rule. The Kandaks were not just queen consorts. They were ruling monarchs with full political and military authority. This was extremely rare in the ancient world. And sixth, their writing system. The development of Meroitic script was a declaration of independence. It said, "We are not Egyptians. We are Kushites. And we have our own language." Deciphering this script fully is one of the great challenges of African archaeology. When we can read it, we'll finally hear the Kushite story in their own words. So this is the story of the Kingdom of Kush. A civilization that lasted nearly 3,000 years. That built more pyramids than Egypt. That ruled Egypt itself as the 25th dynasty. That mastered iron technology when most of the world was still in the Bronze Age. That had powerful queens who commanded armies. That fought Rome to a standstill. That created magnificent art, stunning architecture, and their own writing system. And yet, this civilization has been largely erased from history. Why does this matter? Because the story we tell about history shapes how we see the world. For too long, the narrative has been that civilization flowed from Europe and the Middle East. That Africa was primitive, backward, without history. But the Kingdom of Kush proves that narrative is a lie. Africa was a cradle of civilization. Not just Egypt, but Kush, and the Nok, and Great Zimbabwe, and countless others. The story of Kush reminds us that history is vast. That we've forgotten more than we remember. And that beneath the sands of Africa, and in the pages of untranslated text, there are countless stories waiting to be told. The pyramids of Kush still stand. Silent sentinels in the Sudanese desert, waiting for you to discover them. The next time someone asks you about ancient civilizations, tell them about Kush. Tell them about Pi, who conquered Egypt and then went home. Tell them about Tahaka, who built monuments that still inspire awe. Tell them about Amenirinas, the one-eyed queen who fought Rome. Tell them that 2,700 years ago, Africans didn't just build a civilization. They ruled an empire. Their name was almost lost to time. But we remember them now. We remember the Kingdom of Kush. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. Which ancient African civilization should I explore next? Great Zimbabwe, the Empire of Mali, ancient Ethiopia. The past is calling. And there are so many more stories to tell. Until next time, this has been a journey back to ancient Africa.